Want to welcome you to Gardening in the Mountains, Planting Success, Trees and Shrubs. My name is Allison Arnold. I'm the Extension Agent here in Buncombe County, and I'll be your host today. I'd like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Barbara Fair. Dr. Fair is an associate professor at NC State University Department of Horticultural Science and is the landscape specialist for North Carolina. Her professional and research expertise is in arboriculture, the study of trees. She's a certified arborist and she works with green industry professionals through North Carolina to assist in the development of sustainable and healthy landscapes and landscape practices. Today, Dr. Fair will share her expertise and discuss proper planting techniques for trees and shrubs. She'll help us spot the problems that develop years later if they're not planted correctly. Hopefully, she'll get us off on the right foot with our long-lived green companions. Thank you, Dr. Fair, for joining us. You can take it away.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invite to share all kinds of information with you all today. We talk about planting, and one thing I want to get you guys to keep in the back of your mind, trees are really resilient. And that's a good thing for them, but it's also a bad thing for them. I say that because we do a lot of things to trees that aren't really great, right? We prune them improperly, we plant them improperly, and yet they often still survive. My argument is they don't survive well. When we think about where we get our maximum benefits for our trees, it comes from the largest maturing plants that we can find because they have these very large canopies and they do a lot more for stormwater benefits. And y'all have probably been watching the news lately and seeing what's been happening throughout the country, certainly in the eastern part of the United States with stormwater issues. Trees can certainly help mitigate that, maybe not to the extent that we saw there, but when we think about our day-to-day events and month-to-month storm events, trees can help really mitigate those stormwater issues. But they have to have a pretty big canopy in order to do that. So that means what we plant today has to be able to get very large in the future. And that's our biggest challenge, I think, because we can plant them poorly today and they may live for 5 to 10 years, but not really thrive. Oftentimes we accept something's alive, but it may not really be thriving and doing well. This tree is actually in downtown Atlanta. I was there when I first started back in 2007 for a conference. This was the Olympic Village where they did all kinds of cool stuff, but these trees are planted in really difficult sites. This is a willow oak, which is typically a large maturing tree. You can see that it doesn't look its best. If you remember back to 2007, there was a very serious long-term drought. We can expect those things to continue to happen. The challenge that trees face is these fluctuations that we see, fluctuations in temperature and in water. We have really hot weather and maybe it rains quite heavily and then the temperatures go down and maybe now you enter into a drought. But remember, heat and drought are not exactly the same things and can affect trees very differently. The goal we're going to talk about today is getting trees to live as long as they possibly can and to reach their genetic potential as much as is possible in our urban and suburban sites, because we're putting them in really difficult, non-natural locations, right? I love this picture. And this was a training that I did. I believe it was in Pitt County. When you have a hole that you can sit a few folks around the edge of, then you know you got a pretty darn good hole. You see how we've managed this root ball a little bit, but that's a really important thing to keep in mind. How do you manage a root ball? How is it different for ball and burlap and container grown trees? Certainly, we do have bare root. We just don't plant them quite as frequently as we do some of these other stock options. Even after 10 years or so, you might have a tree that will begin to die. It might have been related to the planting of that tree, but we don't put all of that together. We have 10 years ago that may have caused this tree to decline because, again, we have weather and other factors that can affect that tree. But if we planted it incorrectly, now we add on to the fact that we have this changing climate. We have to be really thoughtful about how we plant and certainly the plants that we're selecting. We may not be able to rely on some of the old species that we've been using so frequently. We certainly have many examples where we overuse a particular species to essentially the detriment of that tree in the long term. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Now, want you guys to look carefully at this picture. I know it's not the best picture, but it was copied from a slide. Some of you might remember the old days where we had the slides in the little carousel. Now we got these great PowerPoints. If you take a look at this, I want you to think about, without me being able to talk to you directly, what might have happened here. What do you notice? First of all, we have a road out here on the far right. We have a grassy area here. And notice this line of holes where the turf hasn't filled quite in again. What do you think might have happened? I suspect, and I pretty much know, that they had planted this particular tree species right here in those first few holes, and the trees did not make it. So they said, okay, must be something going on here. So they moved them back a little bit further. They planted a whole nother row of the same species of tree. These are eastern white pines, which y'all might plant out there in the mountains. Certainly, we don't do that much here in the Piedmont or the coast. But notice the color of those trees. They are starting to have some issues. When you start putting all of those pieces together, which is what you guys do all the time when people call in and ask you for help with an issue they might have, we planted the wrong tree here. The eastern white pine is very sensitive to salt spray. And so we know that salt spray can go a lot further than people think. Either they're going to have to plant this way further back, or they're going to have to pick another species, which I think is what needs to happen in this particular situation. We also plant trees that grow very tall under things that should not have trees planted under them. We think about utility lines, and then that leads us to prune trees in a way that is detrimental to their long-term health. In this case, I would say these trees are not long-lived. There's not going to be a long lifespan for them. You can see a bunch of issues here. They are sprouting back, but they are not likely going to have sufficient energy to produce a reasonable crown in the future. This does not need to happen. There's no reason for us to plant trees that get too big under our utility lines. There are plenty of species that are shorter maturing that we can use, or we can move them back away from the power lines. Obviously, this bad pruning, you can see in this one, you got some dieback. Part of that is what we call sun scald, because when you open a canopy like that up by doing improper pruning, it gets sunburn. It's like when we go out the first of the summer or spring in the sun and don't have sunscreen on, we get burnt. It's the same kind of thing that happens with the plants. There are primarily 3 types of planting stocks, and each have pros and cons. We're going to go through that here in a second. We don't use bare root quite that frequently just because you're planting only during the dormant season. I would love to see us go much more into bare root, but certainly we might not have the diversity of plant species, and we might not have the size that many of our landscape contractors and our big city projects are using. The Ball-and-Burlap, they got there with that tree spade. They put them in wire baskets with burlap in them. Then they pen them all up. They're doing that a lot of different ways now, and I'll show you one way in a little bit. They're all machine dug. You can see this is actually being dug in the growing season, which is not common. There are some species that can be dug. I think red maple is one of those, but most of our trees are dug early in the spring. Of course, they're typically in baskets. If you think about how much soil we're shipping all over the country, it's a lot, and it's very heavy material. So you have to have the means to actually be able to plant that. It's not somebody's going to stick in the back of their trunk and haul it down the road. It is expensive to move those plants around. Certainly, we are being charged for that shipping. Now, this one on the bottom is a container grown plant. And one of the big issues with container grown plants is that they are often root bound. Of course, nurseries want to get the stock up to size and out of their nursery as soon as possible, because that's how they're making their money. One thing is they have 100% of their root system, unlike the Ball-and-Burlap. You're leaving the vast majority of the root system back in that field. I'm always amazed when I see how well Ball-and-Burlap trees actually do in the landscape, because they've got only about 20% of their original root system. Really good growers are actually going out and root pruning those trees in the field with the tree spade a year or 2 prior. So they're getting more development of adventitious roots on the ends of the roots that have been cut. A lot of growers who are doing container grown, when they can them from small little cuttings in small pots, and each time they upcan them, they come in and root prune them. That is super important, because that'll help eliminate these potential girdling and circling roots that form as they hang out in that container. Sadly, not all nurseries do that, but we've got some great nurseries here in North Carolina that actually do that. It is costly and time consuming, because you have to have people that do that for you. One challenge with these kind of pot plants is that they dry out really quickly. And why do you think that is? It's because they're growing in a soilless media. They're growing in peat, or in most cases here, pine bark. We have to think about how we water them once they're in the field. It's fairly easy to transport them because you can stack them on top of each other. You can get small trees and shrubs in 2 or 3 gallon containers, even 1 gallon. Trees I've seen as big as 95 to 100 gallons. That's a big tree to manage. Of course, you're going to pay for that size. I remember being at a conference with the Urban Forestry Council in partnership with NCNLA. We had a speaker. His name was Jim Urban. He wrote a book called Up by Roots, which is a very good book if you're interested. He was a landscape architect. He said to all these nursery folks, we shouldn't be growing or selling container grown trees and plants. I thought the guy's going to get mugged out in the parking lot on his way home. To know your audience is pretty important when we do these presentations. Yes, there's issues with container grown plants, but I'm going to show you how we manage those root balls to help minimize or eliminate those issues. Bare rootstock has 100% of their root system. They're a heck of a lot easier to move, right? Because there's no soil. They're very lightweight, but they also can dry out very quickly. Typically, you're only doing dormant season planting of bare rootstock. That limits the kind of plants that we're going to grow and the size of those plants that we can use. Not many nurseries actually produce them, but if you're interested in fruit tree production, there's lots of catalogs where you can buy those plants. They're shipped in big boxes, wrapped in wet newspaper and plastic bags and stuff. It certainly can be done. It's just not something that you're going to see used in big contracts where we're putting in commercial or even urban and suburban developments. I want to show you one picture because I want you to keep this in mind. There's this little thing called the topmost root. We also call it the first main order root. All that means is as you track that tree down from the root flare, what are those first roots that you encounter? This is the depth that those need to be planted when you put them in the ground, whether it be in a ball and burlap or a container plant, or even in this case, the bare root. That's what you're looking for when you do that. I'll share with you in a little bit how we find those if they're buried in a ball and burlap plant. Everybody talks about volcano mulching. And I'm one of these people driving down the road and suddenly stopping and pulling over to see what's going on. That certainly happened here where I pulled over and parked and got out and started digging. It's just like a little groundhog digging in these root balls. This is not volcano mulch. These are trees that are planted way too high. I want you to think about the issues that we've created here. This is triple shredded hardwood bark mulch, which very many people use. I'm not opposed to it. I just think we need to be more thoughtful in how we use it. We have to make sure that we fluff it up and rake it up each year, or else you get this crusted surface over the top of it. Imagine now we've got this root ball that you see in the picture here. It rains, that mulch is crusted over. Where's that water going to go? It's not going to readily go into that root ball because it's planted so high. We need to plant things at grade. We need to put on the proper amount of mulch. Recently, Ed Gilman came out and was with the University of Florida. He's a huge researcher on tree pruning and planting, got great websites that you can check out. I have the address later in the presentation. He's now recommending not putting mulch at all on the root ball. I don't have an issue with doing that. And his argument is it allows more movement of water and oxygen up and down through the root ball. It's certainly something you can consider, but to me, it's not a deal breaker by any means. It's just a recommendation. This tree on the right is not a columnar red oak. It is a tree that is stressed and is likely going to die. You see the dieback in the top of the canopy. When we see that adventitious growth along the trunk, we know that something is going awry. And that is because it was planted incorrectly. Planted too low. That's what I used to see a lot. And so they've gone way to the other side of the pendulum and are now planting things way too high. When we see this, you're in the root ball, that means likely it was planted too deep in the field. And I know some nursery folks are not wanting to stake them, getting that bamboo stake and sticking it on that tree liner. And the liner is just a big whip that they put out in the field and grow to size. They think it's a waste of time to stake them. So we'll plant them too deep. When you look, you can't even see the first main order roots. On this one, you can see where it was, and you can see that it was planted about 6 inches too deep in the landscape. It was a grafted tree. You can see where the graft is right here. We know that should be well above grade. These roots should have been just below the surface of the soil, and you can see how they've excavated this hole and where that top of that soil really was. So we really need to be thoughtful about that. That's where the depth of that hole actually came to on that plant. I live in Garner, North Carolina, and there's a Walmart not too far away, which I shop occasionally. I also go by there to see what kind of shenanigans they're up to in their landscape. It's not just Walmart. Please understand, I'm not really throwing them under the bus, but it was in a Walmart parking lot that this occurred. These were Freeman maple, which is a red and silver maple cross, which I don't recommend planting here, and it's too hot for them. These trees were planted, I believe, 18 inches from the curb. Number one, they're not in the right place. Number two, they're not the right species for this site. This is how I found these trees. A lot of folks were using this recycled seatbelt material to pull the root balls together to lift them with the forks of a backhoe or whatever they might be using to plant these big, heavy root balls. This was about a 2.5-inch caliber tree. So you're talking probably close to 300, 350 pounds. This just looks bad, doesn't it? This makes us look like we don't know what we're doing. I think anybody would drive down there and say, what the heck is going on here? You can also see that they left the burlap on the top of the root ball and they left the top of the wire basket on. I've done a big research project and it's looking at two different soil treatments. I harvested all the trees. They've been in the ground since 2017. They were about 25, 30 feet tall, some of them. And I harvested the tops and just the other day was able to harvest the root balls. I was so excited that we were able to get them out of the ground pretty much intact. We found the wire baskets were still on there. That's what you would expect after only 3-4 years. But we had cut the top portion of the wire basket off. And that's typically what I recommend to people. Do not take off the entire wire basket. Here's why. If you're buying a tree, say from Johnston County, where the soil is very sandy, that root ball will fall apart. Now, instead of having a ball and burlap plant, you now have a bare root plant. That's quite different. It won't have 100% of its roots, but you've really given that tree a disadvantage by trying to take that wire basket off. Plus, if you've seen the guys jigging these trees around, they need a machine to be able to lift either from those seatbelt straps or by the wire basket itself to be able to align the tree correctly. If you've taken that basket off, you've got no ability to realign that plant. I found the cages were cut well below those main buttress roots on the surface and did not girdle or impact any of the other roots in that root ball, which is one of the reasons that people will say you need to take the wire basket off. Why do we take burlap off? This is natural burlap. It will biodegrade. If you can see right here where my arrow is, you can see where the twine is still wrapped around the base of that tree, holding that burlap together. Even if it's natural twine and natural burlap, it does take a little bit of time to biodegrade, especially if it's above the soil grade. If it's not wet enough to start breaking down quickly, that burlap wicks moisture away from the root balls. That's one of the reasons we want to take that off in particular. How do you find out where that first main order root is? Well, you can use a screwdriver or you can use a survey pin. They have this round loop and a long stem, sharp point at the end. They're red and white. You can buy them from forestry catalogs. The red and white makes them easy to see if you're leaving them around. You take that survey pin and jam it down in that root ball to find out where that first main order roots are. Remember that picture I showed you back at the beginning with me sitting in that hole? And we had pulled away the top of this soil and the top of that root ball. I had already located where those roots were and found that the first main order root was about 3 inches down below the top of the root ball. There's a little bit of soil sometimes on top of those ball and burlaps that you got to push away. You find out how deep the hole has to be before you put the tree in there so you don't have to jiggy jog it around to get it at the right depth. Then you put that in the plant and then you can pull that soil away from the top of the root ball. That's really important with ball and burlap. It allows you to make sure you've got the right depth, that they're not planted too high. There are various videos on my webpage for NC State, a series of videos for planting and how to find that first main order root and how to determine the depth of that root ball. Root pruning is what we recommend for our container grown plants. You're buying them pretty quickly when they're ready for sale. Unless they have sat around in the nursery for a long time, hopefully you're not going to have too many of the circling roots. You may still have trunk girdling roots. So remember, that's different. So what they're showing you here is shaving the root balls. The plant has been stuck in the hole. We've loosely put some soil around it to help hold it up. You can do it on the surface. It just becomes a little more dangerous when you're slamming a shovel down into that root ball. I'm not saying I've done that, but maybe I've made a mistake or two. What they're doing here in this picture is taking that shovel and shaving the outside edge of the root ball off. Usually you're talking about an inch or so. That gets rid of those outer circling roots. The next thing you have to do is what we call butterflying. We don't flay it open. You can slice it down. In this picture, you see two radial cuts that go deep into that root ball. You can see about 2 or 3 inches out from the trunk. You don't want to get too close so you don't hit the trunk. But what we're trying to get rid of there are those trunk girdling roots because those become a very serious issue as the tree begins to grow. They cut off food and water movement throughout the plant. They cut off nutrient movement throughout the plant. And so that's one of the major things that can affect the health status of the plant. It can also lead to tree failure in the future. When I say that, I mean the tree falling over because you might have those trunk girdling roots that you can't see that aren't on the surface. And I see a lot of that with trees. If you see a tree that looks like it goes straight down into the soil, like a telephone pole, then you know that it's not planted correctly. There may be trunk girdling roots down there that you can't see that can lead to the decline and death of the tree and can lead to the failure of falling over. So these are really important to get rid of. But you can see he's done radial slicing throughout that entire root ball and staying just a few inches away from the edge of that. The planting hole, I did talk about this yesterday to a bunch of arborists, and somebody asked me, why is the hole round? What's wrong with a square hole? I want to challenge you guys to think about that. Is there something wrong with the square hole? In the past, I planted trees with a backhoe operator, very large trees, 4 and 5 inch caliper trees. And the backhoe operator dug a hole, and those are rectangular, right? I got in there and managed the hole a little bit to make sure that the sides were chopped up a little bit, but I didn't change the shape of the hole. There's nothing wrong with the square hole. It's just, I think in our minds, the root ball is round, so we make the hole round. That's typical and that's fine. But there's no research that says you should never make a square hole. We typically make these saucer shaped holes with the sides that slope in a little bit. We don't want them straight up and down. And that's what I did with that rectangular shaped hole with the backhoe. I did slope the sides of that hole a little bit. We use augers for some planting, and so they're of course round as well. So that's how we get the round hole. But there's no research that says that a square hole is a bad thing. Obviously, we know that the hole should be quite a bit larger, and you'll see in the next picture that I'm standing in that hole that I made for this particular tree. But we want to make sure that the depth is appropriate. Now, a lot of people will say if it's poorly drained soil, make it even wider. That's 3 to 4 times the diameter. And that's not necessary as long as you're still at 2 to 3 times the diameter. What you can do is dig it a little deeper to start because you're going to build a mound in the middle, a compacted mound of soil at the base, and you're going to set your root ball on top of that. That will allow water to collect below your root ball. That's one way to address it rather than digging it wider. I'll show you a couple things here. This is at the correct depth, but I think it's sunk down a little bit. We don't want to disturb the soil at the bottom of the hole. We want that soil to be compacted so that the plant does not sink. So I'm hoping that this person's actually going to pull down that burlap now that it's in the hole properly. You can fill the hole in a little bit to make sure that you can hold that basket in place if you were doing a ball and burlap with a basket. This again is the hole. When I first got there, that hole was not proper. So I made them slope the sides a little bit more. You can see some of these guys, like this guy right here, is not really very happy with me. They were all like, man, I don't like this lady. Why did she come here and tell us we had to dig the hole differently? It was a very big root ball, so we needed a pretty big hole. But it's sandy soil. They were just being grumpy that day, I guess. I love this picture. This cracks me up, this really old one. This is hilarious for so many reasons, but why we are standing on it, why we think that's going to help this tree at all is silly to me. Look at it. It's about 6 inches below grade. So it's going to be planted way too deep. What happens sometimes there is the tree will produce a whole new set of adventitious roots. Whenever we do propagation, we take cuttings, we root them. That's an adventitious root system. Unless it comes from a seed and the plant grows on its own, we're putting a hormone on that and we're causing it to produce adventitious roots. What happens is if you plant these too deep, it forms a whole new set of adventitious roots. So you're stealing energy from the plant in order for that to happen. I have actually seen people use a compactor, pack the soil around a plant ball. I asked myself, well, why are you digging a hole that's bigger than the root ball at all? Then just shove it into the hole and be done with it. Compaction is a killer of plants. It causes dieback and it will cause a slow death, or it will not allow a tree to establish well when you plant it initially. Their reasoning for doing this is they don't want to stake it. In most cases, we don't need to stake trees, but it's almost always spec'd on big projects. If it's a really windy site, sure. But I think we way overstake things. And I'll talk about staking in a little bit. I don't even want to see you use your foot to compact that soil in there. I think people get scared. They think there's going to be some sort of pore the size of your head in that hole or something that's going to cause the plant problems. Don't even use the back end of your shovel. Use the working end of your shovel and chop that soil down into that hole. You can put half of it in and water it in if you want, and then put the other half of the soil in and water it. But I have just as much success putting all the soil in and be done with it and water it in. I do make a berm or create that moat. I put it at the edge of the planting hole. Some people put it at the edge of the root ball itself, and that's perfectly fine. But I think by putting it at the edge of the hole, you're directing water not only into the root ball itself, but into the surrounding soil. And that gives a sufficient moisture in that soil for the roots to grow into later. No compaction. Before I move to talking about soil, I see there's quite a few questions. And so I'm happy to take some of those right now.
Somebody says they have a row of mature maple trees, evidently coming up through a thick blanket of weed mat and plastic. And the trees seem healthy, but should they do anything about that?
I guess they're saying that they have landscape fabric. I'm not in favor of plastic or landscape fabric staying down on the ground. I know everybody sells landscape fabric, but the problem is that you have a weed seed bank that stays in the soil for a very long period of time. You're going to have weed seeds that germinate below it, and then it's much harder to pull them out. You're still going to have weeds germinate on the surface. But if you want to change the plants around, you want to plant something new in there, you want to dig stuff out, that landscape fabric is a nightmare. I don't like it. Plus, if it's plastic, you're preventing water and oxygen movement down into the root system of the plant itself. If you can cut and pull that plastic back away from the root systems of the tree, that is really important. Get rid of the weeds. You can certainly control weeds with herbicides, or you can pull them by hand or whatever, but I'm not a huge fan of any landscape fabric.
I've been on a landscape where the trees were failing and it was like carpet. It was hard. I'd always heard that baskets over time could girdle roots, but you're finding out that that's not true.
There's been very little research on this. A number of years ago, a person at Virginia Tech, Bonnie Lee Appleton, had written some publications on that. And she found in some cases there might be an issue, but I have not seen it. I have seen wire baskets on plants many times when we pulled plants out to see what was wrong. It wasn't the wire basket that was causing any problem. The plant died for a different reason. The wire baskets that I'm seeing on these trees after 4 years are breaking down already. They're rusting and breaking apart. I want you to think about it this way. How many of you guys have ever seen a tree girdle a fence wire or even electric wires? I've seen it happen where the tree actually grows around that wire. It doesn't cause the tree any issues. I've actually cut trees that have wire in them. It's not good for the chainsaw, but the tree seems to adapt okay to that. And that's why I say we take off the top third of that wire basket because that's where those big buttress roots are going to come down off that tree. If those are girdled, then we probably have a stability problem. But in most cases, it is not an issue.
I have two more. Remind us again how far below grade that first root should be.
Just below grade. If you're a couple inches above, that's one thing. If you're planting a little high, I don't have an issue with that. But when I say a little high, I only mean a couple of inches. I do not mean 6. I do not even mean more than 3. If you're 3 inches or below, you're probably fine. Just making sure that you don't over mulch it. People will always say, well, I can't dig a hole that deep. You have equipment that can dig holes deeper. That's what contractors always tell me. You have an auger. You probably have a backhoe or some other scoop device that you can dig a hole with. Whether the soil is good or not is a different question, and I'm going to talk about that right now. But there's no reason that you cannot plant a tree at grade or just above grade.
One more. An individual says that Clemson has a bulletin out for container grown plants to wash the roots clean so you can see the girdling roots and remove those before you actually plant it.
I'm really glad you brought that up. I am not in favor of that. And here's why. If you want to do that in your own yard for a single tree, that's fine. There is absolutely no research that supports the need to do that. I have heard that Clemson has that, and I'm not going to badmouth another university's recommendation, but I want you to think about it in really common sense terms here. I work with landscape contractors. Remember, we talk about best management practices. A best management practice has to be practical and economical for somebody to employ it. It's based on research and anecdotal professional information that's been gathered over years. I totally understand the reason they want to do that. But what I'd recommended to you and what Ed Gilman has done work on works just fine. It's all time is money. And if you had a landscaper installing 100 trees, do you think they have the time to wash off all of that media? Where's the water going to go? Where's that media going to go as they're collecting it on their site? That would be a disaster. I'd wash roots for research. It takes a very long time to get the media off of a container grown plant. Honestly, it is horrific. Those are really valid reasons for not recommending doing that. It is just not practical for our industry people to employ. I'm always trying to use research to help them be successful. If you want to do that on your own plant in your own yard, or you want to recommend that to a homeowner to do it themselves, that's perfectly fine. But I won't ever recommend that to professionals in the industry.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Let's move on.
I'm going to talk about urban soils a little bit. I always hear people say, oh, that clay soil is really bad. I hate clay soil. If you lived at the coast, you probably say, oh, that sandy soil is really bad. There's no really good or bad soils. It's how we treat the soils that often determines how well that soil is going to behave. What we need to do is think about how and why we amend soils. One of the reasons is in our urban and suburban sites, we've taken away the topsoil. We don't often put the topsoil back, which is a problem. I think that should be a requirement that you cannot take topsoil off of a site when you're dealing with it. Or you have to at least keep it nearby if you don't have enough space on the site to be able to bring it back and put it back. I see too many plants fail because we have failed to address the soil quality. Planting plants in subsoil is not a long-term solution and is not going to grow us those really big, large, maturing, healthy trees. Mostly what we're trying to do is add in amendments. If you want to alter the texture, which is fine, but not necessary, you have to add quite a large volume of compost or amendment to change that texture. Remember, texture is determined by the parent material of what we have going on there. Adding amendments, lots of research on what it does for beneficial organisms and helping plants fight off disease organisms, all are really great. That amendment benefits those microorganisms, which of course are the ones that break it down and make nutrients available for plants. The age-old method we used to talk about was adding a couple of inches of organic matter over the surface of the soil. I personally like to stay down at the 2-inch level. I don't want to add more than about 10 to 15% organic matter by volume. I've done a study looking at adding 30% by volume. What I've found so far is those trees growing in that soil are not doing as well, top growth as well as root growth, as the ones in this more traditional age-old method that we employ. I recommend, and it's much less expensive, I might add in that soil, making that designer soil, shipping that soil, super expensive. Keep that in the back of your mind. When we add amendments, we're reducing that density of the soil. If it's a really compacted soil, we're reducing that density. The research shows that adding it to an entire bed, whether it be a raised bed or not, or you have create a whole landscape bed in your yard, works really well to help improve plant growth and establishment. On a one tree or one plant and one whole basis, adding a few scoopfuls of compost or organic matter has not been found to do anything to help that plant establish. It doesn't hurt anything, but the research shows it really doesn't do anything to help establish or help that plant grow. It's really more about the whole soil complex and doing these amendments on a larger basis. If you're wanting to increase the organic matter level, if you're seeing issues with some of your trees or plants or even turf grass, one method that they recommend is taking compost and putting a 1/4 inch over the surface of everything and letting that break down. They do that to help improve performance of turf grass as well. So there are those methods that you can use rather than just incorporating it. Obviously, we don't want to be tilling under the drip line of big trees. This is what we're looking to create. Something that nature took millions of years to create. We're trying to create it in a short period of time.
I wanted to ask you a question about planting for homeowners. We're not going to get in with a backhoe and do that kind of work. We're out there by ourselves with our shovels. Talk to us about amending the backfill. We don't have sandy soils up here, and we hear different things about amendment. Help us understand that a little bit more, even just plain organic men.
I know there's a lot of information out there, and a lot of it is conflicting information. I'll always encourage you to look at the research-based information. That's unbiased research. That means you're not looking at somebody's product or what they might call research, because research is very specific in how it's done. You have repetitions, you have a hypothesis that you're asking. Does this make sense? You are collecting data over time to look at those things. As I said, it's tricky to get good data on trees and shrubs because they live so long and you have to gather data for a fairly long period of time. I'm looking for that sufficient research that tells me that there is a science-based answer to how this is working or if it's working. The vast majority of the research I've seen for trees, talking about adding any kind of basic organic matter to the backfill, does not help with the establishment of that tree. That means it doesn't help it grow any better or grow any better roots initially when you're planting it, and it's not going to help it grow. What that means is somebody did a project where they had 2 treatments at least, where they had trees that had compost added to the backfill and those that did not. And they found that those that did not probably did just as well or better without adding the compost. My feeling to y'all is if you want to add compost, go for it. It's not going to hurt anything by any means. I tell my landscape guys and gals that if you want to do that, you're going to charge the homeowner for that or the project because it is an added expense. But go ahead and do that. If that makes your client feel better, if that makes the homeowner feel better, there is nothing wrong with that at all. If you're finding stuff that compels you to think this is great, please do it. Absolutely. If you're reading and looking at stuff and you find some really great information out there, certainly follow that guidance. I think that's perfectly fine. I'm just always going to stick with the science-based information that I understand.
Okay, great.
I would love to see us stop and really think about how we affect our soils, because I think we ignore them at our own peril. I'd like to talk about the mismulching of America. I see mulch as the underwear of the landscape. Whether you wear underwear or not, don't want to know anything about it. I think that when we have a tree here, we have a tree here, we have a tree here, and we have a sea of mulch in between, I would love to see us plant plants there and let the plants function. Mulch is very important. Many countries don't have a clue about mulch. They do not use mulch. We seem to be obsessed with mulch in this country. And sadly, we are obsessed with doing it incorrectly oftentimes. This poor little tree in the top picture was only 10 feet tall, so about 1/3 of it was mulch. That is volcano mulch. That is not properly placed. This is a coarse mulch that's fairly deep. I think this is a little too deep and certainly right up against the trunk like that. This is a great picture showing you how that crust of triple shredded bark mulch forms. I don't get as freaked out if you got loose compost up around the trunk of the tree, but when you have mulch like this, that's a little bit different story. We know that for hardwood on most woody beds, you're talking 3 to 4 inches. I usually just say 3 to keep people from getting too crazy. For pine straw, you can get up to 6 inches because obviously that doesn't compact and squish. It does push down over time, but it's a lot looser material. On herbaceous beds, you'll typically see 1 to 2 inches, and I usually say 1 inch. What I often find is the guys are throwing the mulch out there and getting it all over the plants, which makes me crazy. We want to keep it away from the base of the trees, particularly herbaceous plants, because the most common killer of herbaceous plants is poor drainage. We really want to be cautious about keeping it away from that base of those plants, using good products. People ask me, what's your favorite? My favorite is composted leaf material as well as wood chips mixed together because you get the breakdown of those leaves quicker, and then the wood chips will break down more slowly over time. We were using it on campus for a while, creating it in our Hort Field lab. We were getting leaves from campus, and the tree care companies were bringing their wood chips. So we would mix them together, and then we sold it back to campus for a very nice price. A lot of guys complain about it because it had sticks in it sometimes or big chunks of something. You'd be amazed at how much garbage is in that stuff as well. But overall, it had no odor, and it was really a very good product. And it was a closed loop. So campus really liked it. Now they have their own composting system, so they do their own stuff. Mulch has been shown to reduce water loss and moderate temperature fluctuations, and that's really important, particularly with herbaceous plants. There's our mulch ring. Both of these are pretty good mulching. We know that good mulch can reduce weeds, and Dr. Joe Neal, our weed specialist, would tell you it's more like 80 to 90% reduction of competition of weeds. I probably should change that number, but that was the most recent thing I had seen. His work shows it's quite a bit higher. Obviously, you reduce in compaction over time. People ask me about this stuff. Some people like it. There's nothing wrong with that. RBC Center here in Raleigh uses red because it's NC State red. I personally don't care for it. If you have the dyed mulches, as long as they're products that you're buying from a good reputable company, they have been tested. They are not putting chemicals into the soil or causing any issue to the plants. While we may not like this, it is a perfectly fine mulch and it is inexpensive to use on a large scale. This to me is just a terrible landscape planting to begin with, but this is pretty typical. Let's throw a tree in there. Let's throw down some shrubs and some mulch. I would rather see something much more creative, but it is in a parking lot. And so that is certainly challenging. Let's talk about staking. As I mentioned earlier, staking is not normally required, although we spec it constantly. And I think the designers get used to putting it in the spec and they just say, you got to do it. This is hilarious to me. I'm not sure where they thought this poor little tree was going, but it's not going anywhere now. At least they got a watering bag on it, even though it's staked very oddly. I don't ever recommend using wire through garden hoses. Of course, we always have to make sure we get back and take the stakes off within a year time period. All right, there's our Walmart planting again. This was that tree I showed you earlier, planted with the seatbelt straps, and there you can see that tree was damaged coming off the truck. I would have rejected that tree. I would have rejected the planting, of course, too. You can see they're using the poles, and I don't have anything necessarily against this. At least it's in the hole, but I'd rather see them use some nylon strapping rather than the wire. This is the Chinese pistache. That's why it looks so funky. They tend to be kind of ugly ducklings when they're young, just like Kentucky coffee tree. But this will grow out of this particular bend here. And it actually has. This was quite a few years ago. If you look in the background here, you see these Foster holly. I was sure they were going to die. This is coming on spring, but they're evergreen. They should have been fully foliaged. So I thought they were going to die and they are fine. So trees always surprise me in a good way, and that's good. But this is certainly not a planting style that I would recommend. Out of Ed Gilman's laboratory, he did a lot of research, and that's awesome. Research on trees is tough because it takes a long time to get really good data. These are some methods he looked at. All of these are pretty good. The one at the top here that you see, it's a little bit out of the hole. Sometimes if you start interfering with turf grass surrounding that tree, then the turf people get a little bit upset and end up mowing down your stakes. The one that I typically recommend is D. Here's why. What are we actually trying to hold down when we stake a tree? We're trying to hold the root ball down, right? Because we're not trying to hold the top of the tree down. We want the tree to be able to blow in the wind sufficiently because that helps build trunk taper over time. That's really important to how trees build wood and resist the movement from wind. Building that strong taper and those strong buttress roots are really important. So we're really just trying to hold the root ball down. What he recommends, there's 4 stakes on this example. It probably only needed 2 down stakes, but this just gives you an illustration of how the whole system works. 4 spikes going down into the ground. You do have to sharpen the tips of those to make it easier to get them in the ground. You hammer them down in there with a sledge. You put 2 cross pieces on. All of this is untreated 2x2s. You can buy bundles of them. They're pretty inexpensive compared to some of the other staking methods, and they're confined to the hole. So they're not interfering with the turf grass or anything. The beauty is you're using drywall screws, which also break down. These parts are going to break down fairly quickly over time. And you can mulch over most of it. It's not visible and they turn brown very quickly. This is a newly installed tree and staking system. This is what I show people. You can come in later. If you want to take them off, you can come in with a reciprocating saw and cut them flush with the ground, or you can just cut the cross stakes off. On a smaller tree, maybe you only need 2 down spikes and 1 cross beam. It just depends. If you want to make sure you're getting them on top of the root ball and holding them down, that's really the key here. I get a lot of questions about trunk wrap. There has been some research done on that. And a lot of people tell me you do that to prevent frost cracks. You do that to prevent sun scald. Actually, there is no research that supports that theory. Everything that I've read says it does not matter, particularly with frost cracking. But in some cases, they found that putting trunk wrap on actually causes more issues than it resolves. So I don't ever recommend tree wrap being left on the trees. When they're shipping them, absolutely. If you're getting a big shipment in and you're in charge of a big planting, I always recommend tearing off some of that trunk wrap and looking at those trees to make sure no bark has been damaged on those trees, or they stay on the truck or go back to the grower in that case. You'll see trees growing in tubes where you have a lot of deer pressure. This is just one I like in particular because it's mesh and it's going to allow air movement around that trunk. I like that. You'll sometimes see people use the corrugated pipe. They slice it, they put it around the tree. That's fine too, as long as you continue to make sure you're allowing room for that tree to grow in diameter. So these can help prevent damage from animals and stuff. Absolutely. Got no problem using that kind of thing. Again, as long as you're monitoring those to make sure that as the tree grows, you're putting on a bigger pipe or you're taking it off at a certain point in time. And they said trees are pretty tough, right? Water is one of the biggest issues that I see. A lot of people tell me that they can't get their people to water properly. I don't know if y'all ever been to Lowe's or Home Depot, but you watch those folks water and it's just like a real of the wand, right? Not going back to make sure that water is actually getting down into those pots. Think about that in the landscape. Tree bags are great. You might have heard of something called a tree diaper. I don't like the name of that, but I also have some concerns with the research I've seen on that. It's not really good science-based research. I've had some folks tell me it works okay for them, but I've also had folks say it is very dry underneath that. If you think about a diaper, the whole thing is for that diaper to hold the moisture, right? Not really to release it. That's the point until it gets really saturated. So I'm not sold on the tree diapers. These are trees that I turned around, I took one picture and turned back around and took the other. The one tree on the left is in turfgrass without sufficient mulch and not being irrigated. The other beautiful tree is being irrigated in a mulched bed with other plants. How long does it take for a plant to establish? Well, it depends on a number of things. But let's say for a 2-inch caliper tree here in our zones, you might be 2 years for a 2-inch caliper tree. So that's about a year per inch. Here in zone 7 and 8, we are probably more at a year for a 2-inch caliper tree. So really just depends. But obviously, there's always some conditions. And so what we found is soil has to be loose and uncompacted. You have to be able to manage irrigation well. People always seem to think this is a mystery. How do you know when you need to water something? Well, we have these things called phalanges, right? You stick them in the ground and you feel to see if it needs to be watered. For experts and you guys, you're all experts. I would tell you to take a soil probe with you if you're going out and looking around. Makes you look cool. You stick that probe down in the ground in the root ball and the surrounding soil and you see if it's moist or not. Another thing that a soil probe will tell you if you cannot get it into the ground that we've got a compaction issue. I love the fact that he talks, this is Ed Gilman stuff, about a big mulched area in a turf grass. I would love to see plants under this canopy rather than just mulch, because you're going to get so much more from that than just the mulch itself. So again, the root is slightly above grade, or I would also say right at grade, and minimize pruning to just serious structural issues. That means if you plant a shade tree that has a codominant leader, one of those leaders should go when you plant. Especially I tell this to cities and big contractors, because you're not going to get back to pruning that in a timely fashion. Just do it when you plant them. It's not going to cause the tree any harm at all. Some things that limit growth, we know compaction is a real killer. Not irrigating properly. Of course, too much competition from grass and other weeds. Because if you've got them close to the trunk, then oftentimes you have somebody in there weed whacking and causing damage to the tree itself. Way too deep or way too high, like we see in this picture. Any heavy pruning at planting is not a good thing. This is all research-based information I'm giving you. So factors that they've shown to have little or no effect: adding peat or organic matter to a single hole. I already told you guys about that. Adding a root stimulant product. The research shows that it doesn't really do a whole lot to help that plant establish or grow well. Fertilizing and planting, certainly something that I don't normally recommend. It's too easy to make a mistake with adding too much fertilizer and burning those young roots. Mycorrhizal spores, a lot of my arboriculture colleagues and city folks want to add mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae is an association with the tree roots or the plant roots and a fungus, essentially. You need to have healthy, good roots to support the mycorrhizae. If you're not getting good root growth, you're not going to get good survival of the mycorrhizae. I have some people that swear by it, and that's great. Start showing me some of your information that supports how well they're doing. The water absorbing gels, I've seen some research that says, it's okay. Most of the time, not. I've seen people actually do cores and they put that gel down in there and it bubbles up like your volcano experiment when you were in elementary school. For potting media, absolutely. But for soil, not so much. That's what the research says. Bottom line, thinking about what plants we're planting is really important. We're not going to be able to rely on some of our old standbys like we have as our climate continues to change. Planting trees in amended beds or plants in general in amended beds is a much better way to go than putting them out in competition with turf. But of course, we have to have some of that. Don't compact the soil. Understand that trees and plants are amazingly resilient. And there's not one single answer to many of these situations. So if you need me, you're certainly welcome to contact me at my email address there. These are my pruning and planting videos. If you head to that website, there's some pretty cool videos. As I mentioned, there are a bunch of resources at the University of Florida that Ed Gilman's created. We're trying to get some of the designers and landscape architects out there that are doing this work to have consistent specifications that are based on science, not just based on stuff that's been passed around. Thanks a lot. I see we got a boatload of questions. I'm going to let Allison determine how we answer them.
Thank you, Dr. Fair. This is great. You've stimulated a lot of good questions and conversation. Are you able to talk about planting on a slope?
Yes. One of the specs that you'll see at UFL is how to plant on a slope. You don't want half of the root ball sticking out. That is certainly not planting a tree properly. And that's typically how I see it. You're going to have to cut back into that slope a little bit deeper than you think you might to get the entire root ball situated into that hole. It's kind of like carving out a hole and then adjusting the soil slope so that it matches the top of the root ball down to the bottom of the root ball. So you're going to have to do some serious digging and a little bit of manipulation in order to get that entire root ball covered in soil. We don't want half of a root ball sticking out. That's simply not okay. He has a great specification on getting that root ball in the soil.
Okay, great. We'll send both of these resources out to everybody in just a couple of days. We appreciate that. I guess at some point, even in my upbringing and training, there was a thing about whether it was B and B, field dog, and the roots would transition into the native soil easily. But if it was container grown in a soilless media, then it needed some transition into the native soil. And you're saying that's not really found.
Right. But the transition is actually based on how well you plant that tree. When you're digging up soil, do you chop up that soil pretty well when you put it back in the hole and
Okay.
making that hole wider and watering it properly? That's where you're getting that easier transitions from those roots from the root ball out into the surrounding soil of the planting. But it's not just that you have added organic matter in there. It is that you've done a good job with the soil you have. Now, that said, I can tell you about many, many situations where I see there's a site where they just built a few years ago a big Catholic church and they have tree lawns there. You remember the devil strip, right? So they have trees planted between the curb and the sidewalk. There are willow oak, there are elm. Those were the two primary species that were installed. I worked with the landscape contractor on part of that project because She finished the contract and she was so upset with how terrible the trees looked that she wanted to know what to do. She was only doing this out of her concern. What she found is it was all subsoil. There was absolutely no topsoil. So there was no organic matter. It is subsoil that they were planting these trees in. They didn't spec bringing back or keeping any topsoil or adding any organic matter to that subsoil. She did some soil tests and found that it was very deficient in phosphorus. I recommended to put on a liquid application of phosphorus to initially get the trees started and then a slower release one over time, although that will get bound up in that soil to some degree. Sadly, I see a mixed result there, where the willow oak that had been planted 3 years ago are yellowish, they have dieback, and they have a lot of adventitious growth along the trunks of the trees. They are not doing well. Some of the elms are really tough trees, by the way, have started to respond and are doing much better. Some of it's species related, but if they had added just some topsoil, you get organic matter in that topsoil as well when you buy good topsoils. You don't necessarily have to add an additional amount. But when you're planting in total subsoil, you are not going to be effective. You're going to have problems with your plants.
Okay, one more. This is a little off target, but one that keeps coming up a lot that we're interested in is about root pruning. One question came from somebody who has two mature azaleas. They want to move the plants next spring. They were wondering about root pruning in the winter or at some point prior to planting to help create a root ball for that. Or what is root pruning to transplant saplings? I may have volunteered. I'd love to hear your feedback on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would certainly recommend using one of the very long shovels that have the long shovel blade that have a sharp base on it, or you can sharpen that base, which is what you would need to do the root ball shaving that I showed you in the presentation. Using that to go out and around to create where you think you want to. For plants, we often go to the drip line or the edge of the plant canopy. You could certainly start there and root prune a year ahead with somebody that might want to transplant next year. Doing that root pruning now is fine as long as you're not entering into a drought period, as long as the plants are otherwise healthy. You could still probably even do some root pruning later in the summer in fall, because fall now lasts almost into December, it seems, in some cases. You could still do some root pruning in the fall, just sticking that shovel down in there all the way around the edge, and you will promote some new root development from the tips of each of those roots. So that's certainly a fine idea.
So maybe 6, 8 months ahead of time.
I can't really say for sure. I don't know if I've seen any data on that. I can certainly look that up for you and see what recommendations might have come out of some research. I've never seen anything specific. I just want you to be cautious because, of course, in summer, everything slows down when it's so blessed hot. And as long as you're still getting rain and roots are still growing, you can go in and root prune at any time. You just want to make sure you're not stressing a plant that may already be stressed because of heat and dry weather.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fair. We look forward to having you back sometime and you just a wealth of information. I want to thank everybody who hung in there with us today. On August 17th, we'll have someone from the U.S. Forest Service giving us an update on oaks and talking about oak issues here in Western North Carolina. I hope everybody has a great day and we'll see you later, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Allison. You guys have a great day.